Hey guys, Everett Dudgeon 138 here. I'm back again with the Dave Smith Instruments Sequential Prophet X. And for these next couple of videos, I'm going to be going in depth on how I go about creating patches. Because a lot of comments that I got on my previous intro video were, something along the lines of, what, you spent $5,000 for choir sounds, or what, you're just using as a rompler. There's actually a lot of modulation happening in those patches that I had in my intro video, but they're just so subtle that it's more helping the sound rather than being noticeable. Because I found with a lot of the online demos, the samples are very buried in the mix, or they're just manipulated so much with modulation that you really can't tell what they are. That's great for sound design. Not so great if you really just want to have a saxophone patch or something like that. A lot of the demos focus on the oscillator section or the synth side of the Prophet X, which is great. It sounds fantastic. But I already have a Prophet 6. I already have a Moog Sub 37. I don't need another square wave with pulse width modulation or detuned saw waves or anything like that. I look at the oscillators as more there for assisting the samples and modulating the samples and helping them with articulations rather than just a sound on its own. So for this video, I'm going to focus on saxophones, trumpets, trombones, and clarinets, and basically solo monophonic instruments. So I'm going to be going through how I kind of create what in my mind, and I got a lot of positive feedback on the Dave Smith Instrument Forum about this saxophone patch. So I'm going to be talking about how I use frequency modulation synthesis on how to achieve this saxophone patch, because I think it's probably the best saxophone patch I've heard out of a hardware synthesizer. Okay, so when you're doing a saxophone, the first thing you want to do is get rid of the polyphony. Saxophones, flutes, clarinets are not polyphonic instruments. So you don't really want to be playing chords on them. It doesn't sound natural. Let's start with a basic patch first. Boom. Very simple how to get to a basic patch. Just like the Prophet Rev 2, transpose button down, transpose button up, and press hold, and you're already at a basic sawtooth wave. We don't want a sawtooth wave. Let's turn that down in the mixer. There's a couple of saxophones. So let's go to this brass section. There's saxophone A, which is, it sounds pretty nice. And there's saxophone B, which sounds a little bit softer, I think, to my ears. Let's go saxophone A. I like going saxophone A long near. So let's get rid of the polyphony. How do you do that? Very simple. Boom, unison button. Just like on an analog synth, so now you're in unison mode. But, as you can hear, sounds a bit weird. How do we remedy that? Through key mode, which is in the miscellaneous parameters button. I put it to last R, which I believe stands for last note, last retrigger. To my ears, that sounds a little bit more natural. Now, while you're in the miscellaneous parameters section, you also want to take the pitch wheel range up and down to a conservative amount of 1. Because when your saxophones can't do this. Impossible. So bring it to 1. So it has a nice little slur to it. Next, we're going to be doing some modulation. Go to the assign source, which brings you to the modulation matrix. And for the first free modulation, which is modulation 4, set the source to oscillator 1. Set the destination to instrument 1's frequency. Now let's turn up the amount. As you can tell, it gets pretty extreme. We don't want that. I say set it to like 13. That sounds good. As you can hear, it sort of emulates like a brass growl. I think that sounds really nice. But let's put the amount to 0, because we're going to use slider 2 to affect the amount of modulation 4, which is our FM. Set that amount to 13, and slider 2 now affects the growl. But you also want other things affecting the growl as well. And what I mean by that is, let's set pressure to modulation amount, so our modulation 4's amount as well. Again, let's set it to 13. So now aftertouch, if you can hear, brings in a little bit of that growl as well, so you don't need to always play with the sliders. And the next modulation 6, we're going to assign the pitch wheel, or the pitch bend, as it's called here, to modulation 4's amount. So there's a lot of things that are affecting the frequency modulation of this. Because I found when you bend it actually and mix it with that type of growl, it really does bring in that more of a natural effect. So that sounds pretty good to my ears. Next, we're going to be talking about the filter cutoff. Now that's automatically assigned to slider 1 by default. You can of course change that, but I like to set it to a negative amount of 50, and it sort of emulates maybe even 55. Has a nice little swell effect. Of course, you can do nice dips. And when you mix that with the aftertouch, it really has a nice effect. And of course, you can latch it, and it sounds like the saxophonist is playing a little bit softer now. But what are we missing? We're missing vibrato. Now, how do we do vibrato? Very simple, LFO. So the modulation wheel by default is affecting the LFO 1 amount. We don't really want that type of wide vibrato, so I actually just kind of set it to maybe a conservative 1 or 2. Let's try 2. I think 1 sounds more natural. And also with FM, you have to be careful what notes you hit, because some notes sound a little bit off. That doesn't sound that great, but when you... that sounds a bit better. And I have this in a sawtooth mode. You can put it into pulse. That sounds okay. You can put it to sine. That sounds good as well. I like putting it to a saw, have a nice little room reverb, and you're all set. What's great is you can save everything as a saxophone patch like I did. And if you need to do it with a flute or a clarinet or a trumpet, you don't have to touch any of the modulation amounts or any of the modulation destinations that much. You can tweak them if you like, but all you would need to do is just change it to a different instrument. Let's just say a flute, for example. Change the category to winds. Yeah. So now we have the aftertouch affecting the flute. So I think that sounds pretty good. And of course I did like a trumpet, like a Miles Davis type thing. I think that sounds pretty neat. Sounds really natural.